Every morning, Clarence Williams rose before the sun slipped fully over the rooftops. Lived alone now in a small white house on Maple Street, but he never felt lonely. The walls held memories of a long, full life, photographs of his late wife Martha smiling in a garden, awards for community service lining a shelf, and a worn leather briefcase tucked under his bed. He dressed carefully in a soft gray sweater and dark slacks, tying his shoes with slow, deliberate motions. He wanted to walk while the air was cool, before the heat of the day rested on his shoulders. Stepping outside, Clarence paused on his front porch to listen. He could hear birds singing in the oaks that lined the street. A gentle breeze carried the scent of orange blossoms from a neighbor's yard. Across the lawn, a single daffodil nodded in the breeze as if greeting him. He smiled at that little flower, then lifted his eyes to the sky, where early light painted the clouds pink. He felt a quiet joy in that moment, as if the world had rolled out a welcome mat just for him. He walked at a steady pace, hands clasped behind his back, humming a line from an old Ella Fitzgerald tune. His mind wandered back to earlier days. When he served as a federal judge, he remembered chambers filled with books so tall he had to reach a small ladder to pull cases from the shelves. He could still smell the leather-bound volumes and taste the black coffee he drank during long sessions. Thought of the many people who walked through his courtroom doors, some anxious, some angry, all seeking justice. Had listened to them with patience and respect. He had given each person his full attention. When he reached the corner where the old newspaper stand stood, he paused. Its glass door was chipped, and the paint around it was cracking from years of sun and rain. Yet it stood proud, filled every morning with the day's headlines. Clarence turned the handle and slid open the door. He reached inside and lifted the tender page. It smelled of fresh ink and possibilities. He read the headlines carefully, nodding at local news about the new community garden and a charity bake sale next weekend. No national firm felt closer than the small stories of his own neighborhood. Clarence folded the paper neatly under his arm and continued along Maple Street. He enjoyed greeting neighbors during his walk. Old Mrs. Johnson from 2 doors down gave him a cheerful wave as she watered her begonias. Mr. Patel, pruning a rose bush, tipped his hat and called, "Good morning, Judge Williams." Clarence smiled broadly and replied, "Good morning, Mr. Patel," pleased that the honor felt as genuine as any he had ever held in court as he walked. He passed by 3 young men leaning against a brick wall at the end of the block. He had noticed them in the past, but paid them no mind. They had a reputation for rough behavior, spray painting, graffiti on buildings, and breaking small things for fun. Today, Clarence saw them again. One of them flipped a coin high in the air and caught it with a sly grin. They watched as he approached, their eyes following him carefully. He walked past without looking at them, but he felt their stares like cold gusts of wind on his back. A slight tightening in his chest told him that something was not right. He slowed his pace, but kept his focus on the sidewalk ahead. He told himself that they were just idle boys with too much time. But still, he wondered why they seemed to whisper when he walked by, glancing at each other with quick, sharp movements of their eyebrows. He moved on to the community garden at the midpoint of his route. He had helped plan it years ago, back when the neighborhood was different. Now it was a patchwork of raised beds filled with tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. He knelt beside his own small plot, where he grew a single row of basil and a handful of lettuce. He dug his hands into the rich earth and felt its cool strength beneath his fingers. He loved the way the soil crumbled softly between his knuckles. It reminded him that life could be renewed, season after season. He tended his plants carefully, pulling a few weeds and watering the roots. His back ached slightly as he worked, but he barely noticed the discomfort. He found peace in the rhythm of gardening, reaching, pulling, and smoothing the soil. He hummed his tune again, this time adding lyrics in his mind. It was a prayer of thanks for small miracles, new shoots unfurling, sweet smells drifting in the breeze, the sun warming his face. Then he heard them. The same 3 boys appeared at the edge of the garden, voices rising in laughter. They strutted toward him like they owned the place. One of them stepped on a tomato plant's vine, crushing its tender green leaves. Clarence looked up sharply. He gently closed his hands around a vine, feeling its life pulse faintly. He rose slowly to his feet, hands still dusty. The boys called. Out names, "Hey, old man, what are you humming?" Nursery rhymes. Their tone was mocking, but also edged with something darker. Clarence recognized hatred in their voices. He forced himself to breathe evenly and spoke softly. This garden is for everyone, boys. You're welcome to help, but please be gentle. He spoke as firmly as he could, though his voice shook a little. One boy shoved aside Clarence's gardening, tools sending the trowel clattering to the ground. Go back where you came from, Judge, he snapped, though Clarence had never told them his name. The boy spat the words like sour crumbs. Clarence did not flinch. He had faced angry men, courtrooms, men who hated him because of his skin, his rulings, or his presence in a seat of power. He folded his arms and looked at them directly, steady and calm. Before tensions could rise further, a passerby intervened. Ms. Carter, a teacher at the local school, stepped between Clarence and the youths. She placed a hand on Clarence's arm. To guide him away, let them be, Clarence, she whispered. I'll talk some sense into them. Clarence allowed Miss Carter to steer him beyond the fence and onto the path. He paused just long enough to glance back. The boys laughed as they followed him with their eyes. Then they turned and disappeared down the lane. Clarence felt shaken as he walked home. His heart pounded, and his hands trembled when he unclasped them behind his back. He thought about calling the police, about filing a report. But he also remembered the long hours he had spent listening to witnesses, the care he had taken to weigh each word, and the understanding he had shown to those who had little voice. He told himself he would not give these boys the satisfaction of seeing him afraid. At his front door, he paused and placed a hand on the warm metal of the handle. He exhaled slowly, setting down the newspaper. He washed his hands, rubbing off the soil and the faint sense of dread that lingered. In his living room, the photographs looked back at him, Martha's bright smile, their first home on Elm Street, and pictures of children whose adoptions he had signed off on as judge. He sank into his favorite armchair and closed his eyes. In the quiet of his house, Clarence whispered a prayer. He asked for patience, for courage, and for the promise that hate could be met with dignity, not anger. He vowed to himself that he would face whatever came next with the same calm strength he had shown in court. His mind flicked back to the morning's newspaper, to that headline about the community garden's opening day. He believed that the kindness he planted in others would grow, just like the basil in his plot. As the sun climbed higher, Clarence rose from his chair, feeling the weight of the day ahead. He straightened his sweater and picked up his briefcase, not out of necessity, but out of habit. He would carry it to the garden again tomorrow, and the next day after that. He would keep walking Maple Street, greeting neighbors and humming his tune. For now, he sat in his favorite chair and reflected on the day's events. He was an elderly man, yes, but also a man who had spent his life tending to justice and caring for others. He believed that both plants and people could heal, given time, in gentle tending. And so he waited, ready to meet the challenges of the next morning's walk with grace. Each afternoon after his morning walk, Clarence Williams slipped quietly into his garden plot, intent on tending the basil, lettuce, and sweet-smelling herbs he had nurtured since spring. He moved slowly, his back bent with age, but his hands gentle and sure. The rows of green leaves glowed in the sunlight, and he felt pride in every little sprout. He remembered that the garden had once been nothing more than a patch of empty earth. Now it was alive with possibility. One warm afternoon, as Clarence knelt by his basil, he heard voices at the garden gate. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a faded handkerchief. Same 3 young men he had seen on Maple Street stood at the entrance. Today they looked bolder. One leaned on the gatepost, arms crossed, sneering. Another kicked at the dirt, sending small pebbles toward Clarence's plot. The third drummed his fingers on the fence, watching. Clarence rose and tucked his handkerchief into his pocket. He offered them a polite nod. "Good afternoon," he said, voice calm. He paused, waiting for them to return his greeting. But they said nothing. Instead, the boy who had kicked the dirt spat on the ground. "What's with you, old man?" he said. You think you own this place? Clarence's heart stuttered, but he swallowed hard and spoke softly. This garden belongs to everyone in the neighborhood, he said. It was built by our hands. Together, you are welcome to help if you wish. The boy laughed. It sounded harsh in the quiet air. Help. We're not here to help, he said. We're here to have fun. He kicked at another tomato plant, crushing its leaves. Clarence winced as juice oozed from the vine, stepped forward, hands open. Please, he said, be careful with the plants. They take time and care to grow. Another boy pushed Clarence's trowel aside. Watch where you kneel, old-timer, he said. These weeds are tougher than you. He yanked at a lettuce stem and tossed it aside. Leaving it to wilt on the dry soil, Clarence felt a hot rush of anger, but he forced his face. To stay calm, he remembered the hundreds of people he had listened to in his courtroom over the years, some angry, some afraid, many hurt by unfairness. He had learned that anger rarely solved anything. He took a careful breath and spoke again. I know you may not understand the work that goes into this garden, he said, but think of the joy it brings. Fresh herbs and vegetables for families who cannot always afford them, a place for neighbors to meet, and a reason for children to learn about nature. The boys exchanged glances. One shrugged and turned away. Another picked up a handful of dirt and tossed it at Clarence's shoes. Dirt flew like tiny pebbles. One grain embedded in the crease of his sock. He flicked his foot, but the grain stayed. He felt humiliated. The third boy laughed, then kicked over a small watering can. Water spilled in a thin stream, soaking the edge of Clarence's shoes. Clarence's heart pounded. He glanced down at his wet shoes, feeling a sting of embarrassment. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and spoke again. His voice was low but carried. I will not let you destroy what we have built together. The boys froze. He stared at him, surprised by the strength in his tone. Clarence's legs trembled slightly, and he placed a hand on the nearest wooden stake for support. He saw doubt flicker in their eyes. Just then, Miss Carter, the schoolteacher, arrived. She had red hair that caught the sun, and she wore a bright scarf around her neck. She stepped between Clarence and the boys, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Are you all right, Mr. Williams? She asked. Her voice was soft but firm. Clarence nodded. Thank you, he said, relief washing over him. Miss Carter turned to the young men. This garden is a gift to all of us, she said calmly. You want to be part of this community? You will treat it with respect. The boys looked at her and then at Clarence. They shifted uncomfortably. The leader of the group muttered something under his breath and stomped away, dragging the other two behind him. As they left, Clarence noticed that one boy paused at the gate, his head down, guilt in his posture. Then he turned and hurried off to catch up with his friends. Ms. Carter guided Clarence to a bench beneath a maple tree. They sat side by side as dappled light danced around them. Clarence cleaned his shoes with a cloth she handed him. Thank you, Miss Carter, he said. I suppose I should have called for help sooner. She shook her head. You showed them courage. You spoke from your heart. That matters more than anything else. Clarence looked at her gratefully, but inside he felt shaken. That night he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The images of broken plants and mocking faces kept floating through his mind. He thought of his years on the bench, of the countless judgments he had issued, and he wondered why he had been reluctant to call the police. He recalled that judges learn the power of words and understanding, not just force. The next morning, Clarence sat at his kitchen table with the day's newspaper spread before him. He read the letters to the editor and the community announcements. But his eyes kept drifting to an empty space on his calendar, where he usually noted his garden. Visits. He sipped his coffee slowly, feeling its bitter strength fill him. He realized that this small act of tending the garden was not only about plants, it was about standing up for respect and kindness. After finishing his coffee, he reached for a pen and paper. He wrote a calm, polite letter to the local precinct. He described the names and appearances of the young men, the date and time of the incident, and the damage done to the garden. He wrote clearly. He wanted the police to be aware. Not necessarily to press charges immediately, but to keep an eye on the group. He folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and addressed it. Then he paused. Doubt crept in. He wondered if he was overreacting. He remembered telling himself that these boys were just bored. He thought of all the times he had resolved conflicts. Through conversation and understanding in his courtroom, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at Maple Street. The world outside seemed still and bright as if nothing had happened. He felt a pang of uncertainty. Could a formal complaint sow more anger, or would it signal that hate would not be tolerated? He sat back down and folded the letter carefully. Then, taking a deep breath, he placed it on top of the newspaper. Decided that he would give the boys one more chance to change. He believed in second chances. He hoped that they might see the error of their ways if they understood the harm they caused. Picked up his fedora, set it on his head, and headed. Out the door that afternoon, he walked to the garden without his usual hum. His steps were measured, and his gaze stayed ahead. When he reached his plot, he found torn leaves and footprints in the soil. His heart ached at the sight, but he knelt and began to smooth the earth, raking out footprints and pulling broken stems. He worked methodically, treating each plant with care. As he worked, Ms. Carter joined him again, carrying fresh soil and small pots. Together, they replanted the crushed basil and watered the new roots. Children from the neighborhood school wandered by, curious. Clarence greeted them with a gentle smile and asked if they wanted to help. Tiny hands took small shovels and scooped soil, their laughter ringing like bells. The atmosphere lightened. With their presence, and his heart lifted. By evening, the garden looked whole again. The green leaves shone under the setting sun. Clarence stood, brushing dirt from his slacks. He breathed in deeply and felt peace return. He still held the envelope with his letter to the precinct tucked into his pocket. Decided to wait one more day before mailing it, giving the boys every chance to show respect. That night, he sat in his armchair, clutching a cup of tea. He whispered a prayer for wisdom and patience. He thought of the faces of the children full of hope, and he felt renewed purpose. He knew that justice could be served with kindness, but also that sometimes firmness was needed to protect what mattered. He resolved to stand by the garden, by his neighborhood, and by the belief that respect should be as common as dirt. And so Clarence Williams prepared for the next morning's walk, determined to face whatever came with courage and grace, confident that gentle strength would light the way forward. Over the next few days, Clarence Williams noticed small signs of trouble growing around his home. One morning, he stepped outside to fetch his paper, only to see a long, thin scratch right across his front tire. He frowned, kneeling beside it. Running his fingers along the mark, it did not look accidental. The day before, that tire had been perfectly round and ready for his walk. Now a jagged line cut across the rubber as if someone had taken a sharp tool and drawn it deliberately. He pressed his hand to the scratch and felt a jolt of anger, then tempered it with a reminder to stay calm. He replaced the tire with spare equipment from his garage, all the while humming an old tune under his breath. It helped him keep his mind steady. That evening, he checked the garden, half expecting renewed damage there too, but found his basil and lettuce still standing tall. He felt relief, but a whisper of worry lingered in his chest. Who would do this, and why? The next afternoon, on his way back from the newspaper stand, Clarence spotted fresh graffiti scrawled on his fence. Dark letters spelled out a hateful word he did not recognize fully, but he sensed its meaning. He twisted the brim of his hat, studying the messy script. His heart sank at the sight of it. The fence had once been bright and welcoming, painted white with a small mural of flowers. Now that corner bore angry shapes. He knelt beside a patch of clover and gently brushed a small piece of wildflower free of dirt. He stood, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a wad of paper towels. He sprayed them with cleaning fluid and wiped the fence slowly, as if erasing each ugly word might heal the hurt beneath. Later that day, Mrs. Navarro, his next-door neighbor, came over. She was a petite woman with kind eyes, always wearing bright scarves and matching earrings. She held a small plate of homemade oatmeal cookies as an offering. "Clarence," she said, voice soft, "I saw what happened to your fence. I thought you might like some company or help." He thanked her and accepted a cookie. Its warm sweetness melted on his tongue, and he felt gratitude for her kindness. He told her about the scratch on his tire, too. Mrs. Navarro's brow furrowed. She set down her plate beside his armchair and took his hand in hers. "This is wrong," she said. "You have lived here longer than any of us. You have done so much good for this community. You should not be afraid in your own home." Clarence squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you," he replied, "but I don't want to make a big fuss." His voice was quiet, and his eyes looked toward the window where the fence stood. She shook her head. "It's not just about fuss. It's about safety, and neighbors looking out for each other." She stood and offered her arm. "Walk with me," she said. Outside, they strolled down Maple Street until they reached the community center. On the bulletin board, a flyer announced a meeting about local safety concerns. Scheduled for 2 nights later, Mrs. Navarro pointed to it. "You could go there," she said. "Share your story. Ask for support." Clarence nodded, but he felt a flutter of doubt. He was used to solving problems quietly, with measured words. Standing before a crowd made him uneasy. That evening he sat by his desk with a pen and a sheet of stationery before him. His mind reviewed each incident. First, the harsh words in the garden, then the broken plants, and now the tire and graffiti. He wondered if the same boys were behind it all. He thought of the letter he had drafted for the police precinct. He read it again, clear descriptions of the men, times, and dates, and a calm request to watch the neighborhood. He paused at the bottom line. He had left out any demand for immediate action, instead seeking only awareness. He folded the letter slowly. He heard his own breath echo in the quiet room. He looked at the photographs on his shelf. Martha's bright smile, the children he had welcomed into new homes, and the awards he had earned for justice. He realized that he had carried a strong voice once, a voice that people listened to with respect. He had used that voice to protect others. Perhaps now it was time to use it again. But he hesitated, thought of the boys and their mocking laughter. He thought of their sneers as they kicked dirt and crushed leaves. Would a public hearing bring them back stronger? Would it harm the garden more? He rubbed his hand over the scratch in his palm from folding that letter so many times. He placed the letter back on the desk, but left it unfolded. That night, he dreamed of his old courtroom. The benches were empty, but the walls echoed with memory. The respectful shuffle of papers, the hushed tone of witnesses, and the solemn gavel announcing order. He remembered feeling powerful there. He knew that the law was his ally, and that justice could be a gentle but firm hand. He woke before dawn, his heart pounding, sat on the edge of his bed, thinking of what he owed to this neighborhood and what it owed to him. When morning light crept through the curtains, Clarence dressed carefully and set out for his walk. He took a different route this time, circling the block before heading toward the garden. He wanted to see if any new signs of damage had appeared overnight. His boots crunched on the pavement, and his breath rose in small clouds in the cool air. He rounded the corner and stopped short. There on the garden fence, someone had spray-painted a crude image of his face, an old man's face with a stern expression. It was not hateful in words, but its mockery completed the message. Someone had studied his features closely enough to paint them, and that felt like an invasion of privacy. He placed a hand on his chest, his breath caught in his throat. Then, he reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter for the police. He straightened his back and tucked it into his coat. He would mail it today. He told himself that it was not a sign of weakness to ask for help. It was a sign of strength. To protect the community he loved. After the walk, he returned home and then ventured to the mailbox on the corner. His heart beat steadily as he dropped the letter inside. He paused for a moment at the box, watching other neighbors pass by. Some waved at him, unaware of his plan. He tipped his hat to them, feeling a quiet resolve bloom in his chest. That evening, the meeting at the community center buzzed with voices. People spoke about broken lights, occasional loud noises at night, and a stray cat that scared children. Clarence arrived late, slipping into the back row. He listened as others shared stories of small hurts, the kind that grew into bigger worries. When his turn came, a woman named Teresa called for someone to share about hate or targeted attacks. Clarence stood, his legs shaking slightly, and moved to the front. He introduced himself simply, I'm Clarence Williams. I've lived here. For 40 years, I've seen our street grow and change." He spoke of the tire scratch, the graffiti, the fence, and then the portrait on the garden gate. He felt all eyes on him. He held the microphone carefully and met each person's gaze in turn. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the same calm authority he once used in court. He described how these small acts of damage and hate hurt more than property. They hurt the trust that binds a community. He explained that he loved this garden because it brought people together, and he asked for neighbors to stand with him, to watch for these young men, and to speak up if they saw anything. A hush fell over the room. Then Mrs. Navarro rose and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Clarence," she said. She spoke of his kindness and the help he had given to so many families over the years. Others stood to Mr. Patel, with his rose clippers, Ms. Carter with her children in tow, and even a few neighbors who had never spoken in meetings before. By the end, the crowd agreed to form a neighborhood watch. They set up a schedule for patrols and promised to clean up any further damage. One of the police officers present thanked Clarence personally and assured him they would investigate the incidents promptly. As he returned to his seat, Clarence felt relief and pride. He had done the right thing. That night, he slept soundly for the first time in days. In his dreams, the garden grew brighter, the children laughed, and the fence stood spotless. What? Awoke at dawn, ready for his walk, humming his old tune again, not in fear, but in hope. He believed that compassion, joined with action, could heal wounds and bring his neighborhood back to harmony. Yes. And as he stepped outside, the first light of morning welcomed him like an old friend. Clarence returned to the garden the next morning with a calm determination. He walked past the fence where the crude portrait had been painted. But now the angry image was gone, cleaned away by helpful neighbors from the watch group. He paused to touch the smooth wood, feeling a quiet pride that people had stood with him. The sun was low in the sky, and the soft light made the leaves on the tomato plants glisten with dew. He smiled as he knelt to inspect the young fruit, amazed at how quickly green tomatoes could grow when cared for. He set to work gently, trimming a few dead leaves and tugging at small weeds. The laughter of children drifting in from the nearby playground reminded him of brighter days. He hummed the tune from his morning walks, the same old song that seemed to keep him steady through every test. As he straightened up and wiped his brow, he heard footsteps crunching on the path behind him. He looked over his shoulder to see the three young men from before, faces set in harsh lines. They stood at the gate in silence for a moment. Clarence recognized the leader's sneer, the same one that had pushed aside his trowel. His heart beat faster, but he did not step back. He folded his hands calmly in front of him. The boys shuffled their feet, shifting from one boot to the other. Finally, the leader spoke in a low voice. "We're back," he said. "We've got nothing to say to you." Clarence did not flinch. He looked at each face in turn, meeting their eyes. He spoke softly, but with clear purpose. "You have come back after all you did," he said. "I know you feel anger, but this garden is for all of us. The neighbors who planted these seeds want peace, not trouble." One of the boys snorted. He swung his arm to knock a garden hoe from its hook. The tool clattered to the ground. Clarence stayed calm as the sound echoed. He waited for the boy to pick it up. The boy glared at Clarence, then dropped the hoe again. His hands trembled. Clarence noticed the conflict in the boy's anger. Mixed with something like shame, the leader stepped forward, fists clenched. Clarence raised a hand in a gentle gesture, as if offering friendship. "I know I am old," he said, voice steady, "but my years have taught me that hurt only grows when met with more hurt. I ask you now to choose differently." He paused. "You can apologize for your actions. You can help repair the garden, or you can leave and face the law if you wish." The boys exchanged uneasy looks. The leader's jaw tightened. He spat on the ground near Clarence's shoes. Clarence's heart sank, but he did not move. He breathed in slowly, holding his ground. His calm resolve seemed to confuse them. The boy who had kicked at the soil now looked down at his feet. Kicked at a pebble instead, staring at the ground. Then Clarence spoke again, a quiet firmness in his tone. I served this country as a federal judge for 30 years, he said. I decided cases where people's lives depended on fairness. I swore an oath to protect justice and to listen to every person who came before me. He let his words hang in the air. I still believe in that duty today. At the mention of his past, the leader's eyes widened slightly. He glanced at the other boys, who looked surprised, as though they had not expected such authority from the old man. Clarence took a step forward, leaning on his cane. He moved slowly but with purpose, closing the distance between himself and them. "Do not know me," he said. "You do not know my name or my life. But I know yours now." The leader swallowed hard. His bravado slipped for a moment. Clarence saw fear mixed with resentment on his face, felt a surge of hope. "I am Judge Clarence Williams," he said, voice clear, "and I will not allow hate to destroy what we built here." He held himself tall, cane planted firmly at his side. Silence settled over the garden. Even the breeze seemed to pause. The morning light filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the path. The boys looked at each other, then at Clarence. The leader's cheeks flushed. Finally, he spoke in a quiet voice. "We're sorry," he mumbled, barely loud enough for Clarence to hear. Clarence kept his eyes gentle. He nodded once. "You," he said. "Let us see that remorse in action. Help me replant these crushed herbs. Help me paint over that picture you left on the fence. Show that you care about this place too." He reached out a hand toward the hoe on the ground. The leader hesitated, then bent and picked up the tool. He handed it to Clarence, who passed it to the other boy. The third boy took a paintbrush that Clarence had set aside, still glancing at the ground. They moved as a group, working side by side. Clarence guided their hands gently, showing them how to smooth the soil and set young plants in neat rows. Neighbors began to notice. Miss Carter stepped through the gate. Mrs. Navarro came out of her house with a pail of fresh paint. Mr. Patel brought a small ladder to reach the higher parts of the fence. Children from the school wandered in, curious about the activity. They smiled at the young men, treating them as helpers rather than troublemakers. The air filled with polite conversation and the soft sounds of brushes on wood. As they worked, Clarence talked to the boys in a low tone. He asked their names and listened when they answered. He asked what they liked about the neighborhood and shared stories of his own youth growing up on a nearby street. His voice was warm and his eyes kind. The boys gradually relaxed under his gentle guidance. They painted over the garden gate. Portrait with broad strokes of white, covering it carefully so fresh paint would hold. They replanted the crushed basil and watered it with steady hands. By midday, the garden looked bright and whole again. The fence was new and clean, and the soil around the basil and lettuce glowed dark and rich. Clarence stood back, leaning on his cane, and surveyed the work. The boys stood behind him, paintbrushes in their hands, their faces serious but less tense. He turned to them and offered a small smile. "Thank you," he said. "This shows a new path for all of us." The leader nodded, words still seeming hard to find. The second boy spoke first. "Judge Williams," he said slowly, "I don't want to be known as someone who breaks things. I want to help." His voice was quiet but true. Clarence felt his heart open. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then help," he said simply. "Come back tomorrow and help water. Bring your friends. Let's make this garden a place of pride for everyone." The lay boys agreed. They wiped paint from their hands and set down their tools. Clarence watched as they walked off together toward the street. As they left, he whispered a silent thanks for second chances and new beginnings. Neighbors gathered around him, offering smiles and words of appreciation. Miss Carter pressed a cold bottle of water into his hand. "You did it," she said, eyes shining. "You turned hate into healing." Clarence bowed his head slightly. He felt tired, but his spirit glowed with hope. That evening, he sat in his favorite armchair, looking out at the sunset across Maple Street. He thought of the day's events, the fear in his chest that morning, the moment he revealed his past, and the surprising change in the boys' hearts. He thought of the neighbors who had stood by him, and the children who now saw the garden as a place of promise. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks. He asked for continued strength to lead with kindness and for the community to grow ever stronger. In the fading light, he felt a deep peace. He knew he still had one more step to complete his story, one more part where hearts would fully heal and the neighborhood would flourish. But for now, he savored the victory of truth spoken, hate confronted, and a garden saved by gentle courage. Each morning after the confrontation in the garden, the neighborhood felt different. Clarence Williams stepped onto his porch and paused, looking down the street. The houses seemed brighter, as if they had taken a deep breath alongside him. Tire was still whole, and the fence stood clean and fresh. Neighbors waved as he began his walk, some offering smiles that felt warmer than before. He felt a lightness in his chest that had not been there for weeks. When he reached the community garden, found the three young men waiting by the gate. They stood a little awkwardly, shifting from one foot to the other, as if stepping into a new world. Clarence did not scold them or remind them of past wrongs. Instead, he greeted them with a nod and a soft, "Good morning." Their faces lit up at his kindness, and one of them, the boy who had crushed the basil weeks before, managed a small "Good morning, Judge Williams." Clarence smiled and motioned toward his plot. "Shall we check on the seedlings?" he asked. The boys knelt beside him and leaned in close, peering at the tiny basil leaves and the fresh lettuce buds. The plants had recovered nicely, and new green shoots stood tall in neat rows. As Clarence dug his finger into the soil to loosen it, one boy reached out and gently pressed down around a young stem. Another carefully swept away a fallen leaf. They worked side by side, laughter bubbling up when a line of ants crawled across the path. By mid-morning, Ms. Carter arrived with a basket of fresh bread and cheese. Children from her class ran ahead, eager to help. They scattered around the beds, tucking in more seedlings and watering with small cans. The boys joined the children, showing them how to hold the watering can steady, and listening respectfully when the children asked questions about dirt or seeds. The scene reminded Clarence of his younger years as a judge, when he saw hope in new faces and fresh starts. After they finished planting, neighbors gathered by the fence. Mrs. Navarro held a tray of iced tea, and Mr. Patel carried a potted rose to add color to one corner of the garden. Voices rose in friendly chatter. Someone suggested planting sunflowers along the back wall so birds could feed on their seeds later. Another neighbor proposed painting a small mural of community scenes on a side fence. Clarence listened, proud to hear laughter instead of harsh words. When the group paused for a break, Clarence rose slowly and spoke. "I want to thank everyone for coming together," he said. His voice was soft but carried across the garden. "This place belongs to all of us. When we protect each other, our lives grow stronger." The neighbors nodded, and the boys looked at each other with surprise, as if hearing words of respect spoken aloud for the first time. One of them, the leader, said quietly, "We didn't know we could help like this." Clarence smiled and replied, "You are part of this community now. We grow by standing together." That afternoon, word of the garden's revival spread. A local reporter drove by and asked for a quick interview. Clarence agreed, standing among the plants as cameras rolled. He spoke simply about how small acts of kindness and responsibility could heal the deepest wounds. He mentioned the young men by name, praising their choice to do good rather than harm. The boys stood nearby, uncertain at first, then proud as neighbors patted them on the back. When the interview ended, the reporter thanked them all and promised to share their story of unity. In the days that followed, the community center arranged a small ceremony in the garden. A banner stretched across the fence reading Maple Street Community Garden. Clarence was invited to say a few words. He stood on a small wooden bench, holding his cane like a badge of honor. The neighbors gathered close, and the children formed a line, each holding a small potted plant to add to the soil. He spoke about hope and dignity. He told them that age might bend our backs but never break our spirits. He reminded them that every person, young or old, had a role to play in making a place kind and safe. The three young men stepped forward, handing their pots to children who placed them in the beds. The crowd applauded gently, celebrating a new chapter for the garden and for the neighborhood. After the ceremony, neighbors shared snacks and stories under a canopy of maple leaves. Clarence sat with Mrs. Navarro and Ms. Carter, sipping lemonade. They laughed about small things, how one tomato plant leaned into the sun, how a robin had built a nest in the old oak nearby. The three young men joined them, shy at first, but soon chatting about school and hobbies. One said he liked to draw, and another that he wanted to learn about plants. Clarence promised to teach them more about the garden's history, and offered to lend them books on basic gardening. That evening, Clarence returned home with a gentle tiredness in his bones. He hung his hat by the door and washed his hands, feeling the cool water run away the heat of the day. He sat in his armchair and looked at the photo of Martha on the wall. He thought about the journey he had taken from quiet mornings of harassing whispers to a community standing united. Whispered thanks to her, as if she were beside him, nodding in approval. He opened his briefcase not for papers, but for the small journal he kept beside his gavel years ago. Inside, he wrote a simple note: Maple Street, 7th of July, 2025. Today, unity bloomed like basil in spring. He closed the journal and set it on his side table, where he could open it tomorrow morning. On his evening walk, he paused by the fence where neighbors had painted a new mural. Bright flowers, a watering can, children's faces, and three young men smiling as they worked. Beneath the image, someone had written in neat letters, "Together we grow." Clarence stood quietly, his heart full. He touched the painted wood gently and heard the soft rustle of leaves above him, like applause. From the trees, as he walked the rest of his route, neighbors greeted him with nods and waves. A young family stopped to thank him again, and the children offered him fresh mint leaves from the garden. He accepted graciously, placing one between his fingers before tucking it behind his ear. His steps felt light, and he hummed his old tune, this time with added words of celebration. The neighborhood hummed along with him, joined by bright porch lights and open doors. That night, Clarence fell asleep, listening to the soft sounds of his home-man old clock ticking, a distant dog's bark, the whisper of a breeze against the window. In his dreams, he saw the garden in full bloom, people dancing around the beds, laughter filling the air. He dreamed of hands reaching across fences, of children learning the names of herbs, and of the three young men teaching others what they had learned. The next morning he woke before dawn, as he always did. He dressed and stepped outside, lantern in hand, though the sky was already pale with approaching light. He walked to the garden's gate and opened it, letting in the morning. Dew glistened like tiny diamonds on every leaf. He knelt and pressed his palm into the soil, feeling life pulse through the earth. He stood and gathered a handful of basil. Inhaling its sweet scent, he walked home slowly, carrying the basil in his coat pocket. When he reached his kitchen, he filled a pot with water and dropped in the leaves. Steam rose in gentle curls as the scent filled the room. He poured himself a cup of tea, adding a few leaves from his pocket. As he sipped, he reflected on the path that had brought him here, years of service on the bench. Quiet mornings of prayer, moments of doubt balanced by the strength of his friends. He believed now, more than ever, that dignity could shine even in small places, and that courage need not, Roart could whisper, steady and sure. He made a vow to continue walking Maple Street, to keep tending the garden, and to share his story with anyone who needed hope. He knew that storms might come again, but he also knew the power of a community that chose compassion over fear. And so, Clarence Williams, retired judge and gentle guardian of Maple Street, finished his tea and stepped onto his porch, ready for whatever the day would bring. His hat was secure, his cane by his side, and his heart guided by the simple truth he had lived: when people stand together with respect and kindness, their roots grow deep and their spirits flourish like the sweetest basil in the garden,